Next up in our Kingdom series, teaching series here on YouTube, we're going to keep moving through the Kingdom of God references that show up in the book of Acts. If I remember right, there was 8 total. I think we've gone through, 3, the first 3 references of the Kingdom of God in the book of Acts. I want to go to the next one. We only need 1 reference, I think, today to learn something about the Kingdom of God. I think it's actually a doozy. I say this all the time. I don't think it's going to be a long conversation. I don't think it actually takes much for us to learn what we're going to learn today. It's going to be difficult to learn it. It's not going to be complex. It is not easy, but it is very simple. It's a simple idea. It's very, very difficult for us, especially for those of us that are in a Western American context, for us to wrestle with. But the next Kingdom of God reference in the book of Acts shows up in Acts chapter 14. I believe it was verse 22. And we're going to read it, and then we're going to talk about some context here. They returned to Antioch in Syria, is what it's talking about. Paul and those on the missionary journey, and that's what this is referencing. It says this in Acts 14. They preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, was the reference. There's a reference. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. After going through Pisidia, they came into Pamphylia, and then when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. So, little passing reference. They're going on this missionary journey. They're stopping in all these places, and yet there's this reference where in the midst of all of these travels, they tell the believers, we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. Now, here's what I find. Let's pull back and look at some context here. Like if you were to go back all the way to say Acts 13, we talk about their time on Cyprus, and then we read about their time in Pisidia and Antioch, and that's anything but. Pisidia and Antioch, everything's going so well, they get invited back, but then they make everybody mad at Pisidia and Antioch, and they get forced to get run out of town. Everywhere they go, they're being chased by these naysayers and people who are kind of against their ministry, trying to stop what they're doing. You get to chapter 14, and the whole chapter is just like stop after stop, and them encountering opposition, right? So Iconium, right? But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message by his grace. There was a plot amongst both Gentiles and Jews together with their leaders to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe. So they get to Lystra. You probably remember the story of Lystra. They get to Lystra, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. They're in the Lycaonian region, and they go in there and they heal this man who's lame, and he jumps up on his feet, and they try to worship, but then they like get them to stop worshiping. But then there are these folks that are following them around, and they get people stirred up, and then they stone Paul. So in the last city, They were going to stone them, but they escape. In Lystra, they actually stone Paul so badly that they leave him for dead outside the town. Paul gets up and tries to go back into Lystra, and the disciples have to stop him. From there, they go on to, was it Iconium? Excuse me, let me make sure. So from there, they go on from there to Iconium. And then from there, Antioch in Syria, and everywhere they go, they just meet this opposition head on. And so they tell the believers, their response to this is, we must endure hardships for the kingdom of God. I actually have a lesson that I do on this in Turkey. And it works a lot better when I have a bunch of people there to read different passages. I don't want to sit here and read you a bunch of proof texts on this YouTube video. But this is a big deal in your New Testament. One that we typically read over because we don't like it. But this is a big deal. And it's not that... See, here's what the typical Westerner, I think, wants to do. Okay, Marty, so you're telling me that we have to endure hardships to enter the kingdom of God. So that means that there's some kind of method, some mechanic where part of what I have to do is to go through hardships in order to go to heaven. Or in order to get, like, I now have to go find hardships so that I can go... No. That's making this too much of a process. It's bringing a Western paradigm and a mechanic, trying to figure out how it works so I can produce the end that I want to produce. It's not the mechanic, it's the assumption. That's what we can learn here in this passage. The assumption of the early believers. And this is true for the New Testament. This is true for what we would call the apostolic age. This is true for the early church, the disciples of the disciples. The assumption in the first 2 centuries of the church is that you are going to go through hardships. The assumption is that if Jesus suffered and died, many of us would have to suffer as well. Some of us would die. That was the assumption. Again, it's not that you go looking for hardship. It's not that you go looking for suffering. It's not that you go trying to die. It's that the assumption in their world was, if this is what Jesus went through, then these are the things that we can expect to go through as well. It's what our rabbi did. It's what we'll do. And that was the assumption, right? Their assumption was that Jesus went to the cross to show us how to, not that Jesus went to the cross so that we wouldn't have to. And that's a key difference in the early church to the church that we're more familiar with today. In our current modern day classical theology, we teach that Jesus went to the cross so that I don't have to. But the better, more biblical understanding in their world, in the world of the New Testament, is that Jesus went to the cross to show us how to, that we would follow in his steps. And the assumption is that hardships is. And so, again, I think the tricky danger in teaching this is that everybody thinks that we now have to go produce a life of suffering. That's not what the teaching is. The teaching is that they assumed that, and to ask us to question the assumptions that we make about the kingdom of God today. I think most of us look at suffering and hardship as an indication that we are not in the will of God. That when we're going through suffering and hardship, something must be wrong because this isn't God's desire for my life. And while I wouldn't turn around and say it is God's desire for your life that you would suffer, I would invite us to learn from the ancient record of Acts that the assumption is that hardships are a part of following Jesus. So if you're going through hardships and trials, if you're going through seasons of suffering, the early Christians would have said, of course you are. You're a follower of Jesus, aren't you? You want to be a part of the kingdom of God, don't you? What can we learn about the kingdom of God? The kingdom of God is often a way of suffering. It's the assumption. If that's what Jesus taught us about, if that's what he modeled, if that's what he did, well, of course we're going to have to do that too. So I would say, I would invite us to maybe question the assumptions that we have, that if we are doing God's will, it's supposed to be comfortable, easy. Is there anything else that comes out of this reflection? Is there anything else? Let's read it one last time. Then they returned to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, strengthening disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. So it's going to be a challenge to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in which they had put their trust. After going through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia, and when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. That this would be the assumption. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. May that be a learning point for us today. The kingdom of God is not void of hardships. The kingdom of God, maybe a final takeaway is that we need to quit trying to figure out like what the mechanic is. Like what's the process? If I do this and then this and then this and then this, I get into the kingdom of God. If I do this and this and this, then I get to go to heaven. If I do this and this, like the Bible's just never engaging in that kind of conversation. The Bible is assuming this covenantal relationship with a Jesus who came to show us how to have abundant life in the midst of things like hardship and suffering. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. And Jesus does not say that to trivialize suffering or hardship. He says that to put hardship in its proper place, which is that to recognize its existence and to remind ourselves it's a part of something so much greater that God's doing in the world. But you will have it. You will have it. It's not an indication that you're doing something wrong. It's not an indication that God is displeased with you. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. I was just not too long ago, one last thought before we close our video. We were having Passover. And there are a few times in the Passover Seder where one of the things that you do is you remember the bitterness. You remember the hardship. You remember that shalom, liberation, deliverance. It comes with some sense of struggle, suffering, pain. Like there are tears. Like multiple times in the Passover Seder, you dip things in salt water, and the salt water reminds you of the tears. Tears that our ancestors have cried. Because we stand on the shoulders of people that have gone through hardships, not comfort. They went through things to get where they were going. And that was because they were walking in the way of God, not because they were out of it. Sometimes negative consequences, things that we endure, sometimes those things are the results of sinful rebellion. But sometimes obedience leads us straight into the heart of hardship. So may we reorder the way we understand the world is. May we understand the way that we see the kingdom of God as not something that rescues us or keeps us from hardship, but maybe as a path that leads us at times straight into it. Those are my thoughts for today. I think in our next video, we may wrap up the rest of the references in the book of Acts for our Kingdom of God series. So we'll look forward to chatting, and we'll talk to you then.